Rome did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it stopped trusting itself. Behind every emperor stood whispers of poison, betrayal, and invisible enemies. In ancient Rome, conspiracy wasn't madness, it was how power survived. Chapter 1. A civilization built on suspicion. Rome did not become an empire by trusting easily. From its earliest centuries, Roman political life was shaped by betrayal, sudden violence, and the constant fear of internal collapse. Kings were expelled in 509 BCE not through peaceful reform, but through conspiracy and assassination. The republic that followed was born already suspicious of concentrated power, built on checks, rivalries, and the assumption that no man could be trusted for long. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, that suspicion intensified. Power grew faster than stability. By the 1st century BCE, civil wars had become routine. Generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar marched on their own city. Assassination was no longer shocking, it was political language. When Caesar was murdered in 44 BCE by senators who claimed to be saving the republic, the lesson was clear to everyone watching. Authority in Rome was always temporary, and enemies were often closest. The transition from republic to empire did not remove this culture of fear. It institutionalized it. Emperors ruled without formal limits, but they ruled alone. There was no free press, no transparent courts, no safe opposition. Information moved through whispers, through slaves, freedmen, soldiers, and household staff. Rumor became a survival tool. To hear a warning early could save a life. To repeat the wrong story could end it. In this environment, conspiracy theories were not irrational fantasies. They were logical responses to lived experience. Roman history was filled with real plots. Senatorial coups, praetorian assassinations, poisoned heirs, forged accusations of treason. People disappeared without trials. Executions were announced after the fact. Official explanations were brief, vague, and often contradictory. Roman writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio recorded this atmosphere with visible unease. They described a society where truth was unstable, where public loyalty masked private terror, and where silence itself could be interpreted as guilt. In such a system, distrust was not cynicism, it was caution. Rome's darkest conspiracy theories did not emerge from imagination alone. They emerged from patterns. When power changed hands violently, when deaths went unexplained, when enemies were declared overnight, people learned to read between the lines. In ancient Rome, suspicion was not a flaw in the system. It was one of its foundations. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Palace, Murder. As imperial policy, no threat haunted the Roman elite more than poison. Unlike blades or legions, poison left no witnesses, no battlefield, and often no clear culprit. It moved silently through cups, food, and medicine, making it the perfect weapon in a political system where proximity meant danger. By the early Roman Empire, fear of poisoning had become an obsession, especially inside the imperial household. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, officially died of natural causes in 14 CE, but rumors spread immediately that his wife, Livia, had hastened his death to secure the succession of her son, Tiberius. Ancient historians did not present this as proven fact, but the suspicion itself mattered. It revealed how Romans understood power. Succession was rarely clean, and death was rarely innocent. Under Tiberius, the fear deepened. He withdrew from Rome to Capri, ruling through letters and intermediaries, while accusations of secret poisonings circulated through the Senate. Informers, delatores, thrived by alleging hidden plots, many involving slow-acting toxins. Trials for treason often rested on whispers rather than evidence, reinforcing the belief that murder was being carried out invisibly. The reign of Claudius intensified these anxieties. When he died suddenly in 54 CE after a banquet, ancient sources such as Tacitus and Suetonius reported widespread belief that he was poisoned, possibly with toxic mushrooms, by his wife Agrippina to elevate her son Nero. Whether true or not, the story became canonical, embedding poison at the heart of Roman imperial conspiracy theories. Under Nero, fear turned outward. Elite Romans hired food tasters. Physicians were distrusted, even medicine was suspected as a delivery system for assassination. Poison manuals circulated quietly, and laws against poisoning multiplied, suggesting not control, but panic. In ancient Rome, poison symbolized the ultimate conspiracy: murder. Without confrontation, power without accountability. Its prevalence in rumor and record reflects not only real crimes, but a society convinced that the greatest threats were always unseen. Chapter 3. Manufactured enemies. When the state invented threats, Roman power depended not only on eliminating real rivals, but on defining enemies when none were visible. In moments of crisis, fires, plagues, military defeats, or economic instability, authorities often turned to conspiracy narratives to restore control. Fear needed a target, and the state was prepared to supply one. One of the clearest examples followed the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Large sections of the city burned for days, and rumors quickly spread that Emperor Nero himself had ordered the fire. To deflect suspicion, Nero accused a small and largely misunderstood religious group, the Christians. According to Tacitus, they were portrayed as secretive, antisocial, and hostile to Roman traditions. Executions followed, not because of proven plots, but because the label of conspiracy made repression acceptable. Christians were not the only group cast in this role. Astrologers were repeatedly expelled from Rome, accused of predicting imperial deaths and encouraging rebellion. Philosophers, especially Stoics, were suspected of promoting moral resistance to tyranny. Foreign cults, such as those of Isis or Bacchus, were investigated and suppressed when their rituals were deemed too private or emotionally intense. Privacy itself became suspicious. These groups were framed as operating in shadows, bound by secret oaths and hidden loyalties. That image was powerful. By defining them as conspirators, emperors justified surveillance, exile, and execution without public evidence. The absence of transparency worked in the state's favor. When trials were closed or charges vague, rumor filled the gaps and reinforced the danger. This pattern reveals how conspiracy thinking functioned as policy. By inventing internal threats, Roman rulers redirected public anger away from imperial failure and toward vulnerable minorities. The result was a cycle. Fear produced accusations. Accusations produced repression, and repression confirmed the belief that conspiracies were everywhere. In ancient Rome, the most dangerous enemy was often not real resistance, but the idea of it. And once that idea took hold, it became one of the empire's most effective tools of control. Chapter 4. Omens, Prophecies, and Fake Fate. Religion in ancient Rome was not a private matter of belief. It was a public system of control, tightly woven into politics, law, and legitimacy. Omens, prophecies, and divine signs were treated as evidence of the gods' approval or warning. But in a world where fate guided policy, controlling fate meant controlling power. Official priests interpreted the will of the gods through augury, haruspice, and sacred texts like the Sibylline books. These interpretations were not neutral. Access was restricted, and readings were often shaped by political need. When inconvenient omens appeared, they could be reinterpreted, delayed, or quietly ignored. When useful signs emerged, they were amplified and publicized. Roman historians recorded multiple cases where omens conveniently aligned with imperial interests. Before Augustus consolidated power, signs were reported that the gods favored his rule, reinforcing the idea that resistance was not just treason, but impiety. Later emperors followed the same pattern. Victories were attributed to divine favor, while disasters were blamed on moral failure or hidden enemies within the state. Prophecies also generated fear. Predictions of an emperor's death were treated as political weapons. Astrologers who forecasted succession, accurately or not, were exiled or executed. Under Tiberius and Domitian, entire groups were punished for allegedly spreading dangerous predictions, even when no evidence of organized plotting existed. This manipulation created a deeper suspicion among the population. Romans began to question whether fate was revealed, but manufactured. When disasters struck despite favorable omens, trust eroded. People whispered that the gods were being misrepresented, or worse, that Divine signs were staged to justify violence and repression. In this environment, superstition and conspiracy merged. Omens no longer reassured the public, they unsettled it. The divine became another language of power, and belief itself became a battlefield where truth was shaped by those who controlled interpretation. Chapter 5. The Senates. Shadow wars behind Rome's marble facades and ceremonial speeches. The Senate operated in a climate of constant fear. Officially, senators were the guardians of Roman tradition and law. In reality, by the imperial period, the Senate had become a battleground of hidden alliances, silent rivalries, and lethal accusations. Power was no longer seized openly, it was whispered into existence. Senatorial conspiracies were not rare anomalies. They were recurring features of Roman political life. The most famous example remained the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE. A plot organized by senators who believed they were acting in defense of the Republic. That event permanently poisoned trust within Rome's ruling class. From that moment on, emperors viewed the Senate not as partners, but as potential enemies. Under emperors like Tiberius and Domitian, this suspicion hardened into policy. Charges of maestas, treason against the emperor, became tools to eliminate rivals. Accusations required little proof. A careless remark, a private letter, or even an expression of grief for a condemned man could be interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. Trials were often conducted behind closed doors, and verdicts were rarely acquittals. Informers flourished in this environment. Known as delatores, they thrived by exposing alleged plots, real or imagined. Their testimonies fueled a cycle of paranoia. Executions created fear, fear produced denunciations, and denunciations justified further executions. Senators learned that survival depended not on loyalty, but on invisibility. Silence became dangerous, so did ambition. In the Roman Senate, conspiracy was both feared and expected. Even when no plot existed, the assumption that one might is enough to destroy lives. This was not governance through law, it was rule through suspicion, where the shadow of conspiracy proved more powerful than conspiracy itself. Chapter 6. The Emperor as the ultimate conspiracy theorist. As imperial power concentrated in one individual, suspicion often followed. Many Roman emperors did not merely fear conspiracies, they expected them. Surrounded by flatterers, informers, and rivals, emperors lived in a world where loyalty was impossible. To verify and betrayal seemed inevitable. Paranoia was not a personality flaw. It was a political condition. Tiberius set the pattern. After withdrawing to Capri in 26 CE, he governed from isolation, relying heavily on reports from informers. Alleged plots multiplied, and executions followed. Tacitus described a reign dominated by fear, where accusations of conspiracy spread faster than evidence. The emperor's suspicion reshaped justice itself, turning rumor into law. Caligula's short reign deepened the crisis. His erratic behavior and public humiliation of elites convinced many that the state had become unstable. Real conspiracies emerged in response, including the plot that assassinated him in 41 CE. In this case, paranoia was both cause and consequence. Fear produced tyranny, and tyranny produced resistance. Domitian institutionalized suspicion. He treated the Senate as a hostile body and believed assassins were everywhere. Philosophers were exiled, senators executed, and even family members suspected. Ancient sources describe an atmosphere where speaking freely was impossible and silence equally dangerous. When Domitian was finally killed in 96 CE, it was by members of his own household, a confirmation, in his enemies' eyes, that fear had been justified. Commodus inherited this legacy. His reign saw purges driven by perceived plots rather than proven threats. Governance narrowed to personal survival, and the empire suffered accordingly. In Roman history, the belief in conspiracy often created the conditions for real conspiracies. Fear reshaped policy, policy bred resentment, and resentment eventually turned into violence. The emperor's greatest enemy was not always a hidden plot, but the certainty that one existed. Chapter 7. Did Rome engineer its own collapse? Long after the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century CE. Romans themselves had already begun searching for hidden causes behind their decline. Ancient writers did not describe collapse as sudden or accidental. They described rot, betrayal, and internal sabotage. For many, Rome did not fall, it was undone from within. Rumors of economic manipulation circulated widely. Coinage was repeatedly debased during the 3rd century. Crisis, eroding trust in imperial authority and accelerating inflation. Soldiers demanded higher pay, emperors responded by weakening currency, and the population whispered that officials were enriching themselves while the empire bled. Whether intentional or desperate, the result appeared conspiratorial to those who suffered its effects. Military disloyalty fueled similar suspicions. Emperors were proclaimed and murdered by their own armies with alarming frequency. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors rose and fell. Many through internal betrayal rather than foreign invasion. To Roman observers, this looked less like chaos and more like systemic self-destruction, in empire consuming itself through ambition and fear. Court corruption deepened the narrative. Powerful officials manipulated access to emperors, controlled information, and eliminated rivals through accusation rather than confrontation. Decisions were increasingly made in isolation, based on suspicion instead of strategy. Ancient historians like Ammianus Marcellinus described a government paralyzed by mistrust, where competence mattered less than perceived loyalty. Modern historians debate how far conspiracy truly drove Rome's collapse. Structural pressures, economic strain, overextension, external threats, were real and measurable. Yet the Roman obsession with hidden enemies magnified every crisis. Distrust weakened institutions, fractured leadership, and encouraged short-term survival over long-term stability. In the end, Rome's darkest conspiracy may not have been a single plot, but a culture that assumed betrayal everywhere, and slowly governed itself into ruin. Chapter 8. Whispers that survived the empire. Rome's emperors are gone, its legions dissolved, and its senate reduced to ruins, but its culture of suspicion never disappeared. The conspiracy thinking that shaped Roman politics outlived the empire itself, migrating into later states, religions, and systems of power that inherited Rome's structures and anxieties. Medieval and early modern rulers studied Roman history closely. They learned not only from its laws and armies, but from its fears. Secret police, informant networks, accusations of hidden enemies, and the use of conspiracy to justify repression all echoed Roman precedents. The belief that threats operate invisibly, that danger must be rooted out before it appears, became a recurring justification for centralized authority. Roman historians themselves ensured this legacy. Writers like Tacitus framed imperial rule as a theater of deception, where truth was buried beneath fear and performance. Their works shaped how later generations understood power, not as transparent command, but as something exercised through silence, rumor, and controlled narratives. Rome continues to fascinate because it feels familiar. Its leaders feared internal enemies more than external ones. Its citizens questioned official explanations. Its rulers claimed to protect stability while dismantling trust. These patterns are not ancient curiosities, they are enduring political instincts. The empire was not undone by whispers alone. But whispers shaped decisions, justified violence, and altered history's course. Rome teaches a final lesson. When power depends on secrecy, conspiracy becomes inevitable. The question Rome leaves behind is not whether conspiracies existed, they did, but whether a civilization can survive when it no longer knows whom to trust. History rarely collapses in public. It erodes in silence, suspicion, and fear. If you want to keep uncovering how power truly works, beyond myths, monuments, and official stories, subscribe. Because the most dangerous forces in history are often the ones we're told not to question.